September 12, 1944. 13:47 hours. South China Sea, 250 miles northeast of Luzon. Lieutenant James O'Connor pressed his face against the steel bulkhead of the Rakuyo Maru's cargo hold, gasping for air that barely existed. Around him, 1,318 Allied prisoners of war sat packed so tightly that when one man fainted, he remained upright, held in place by the crushing weight of bodies on all sides. The stench was beyond description. Human waste, vomit, infected wounds, and the sweet smell of men dying. No ventilation reached the holds. No food had been distributed in 3 days. The Japanese guards had sealed the hatches, leaving the prisoners to suffocate slowly in temperatures that exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. O'Connor had survived 3 years as a prisoner since the fall of Bataan. He thought he understood the depths of human cruelty, but the hell ships, Japanese transports moving prisoners from Southeast Asia to slave labor in Japan, represented a new form of systematic murder disguised as transportation. When the torpedo explosions ripped through the hull at 13:50 hours, O'Connor's first thought was relief. Death by drowning seemed merciful compared to slow suffocation in the ship's steel tomb. What he couldn't have imagined was that salvation would come from the very enemy he expected to machine gun survivors in the water, the maritime death system. The Japanese hellship program had been operating since 1942, transporting over 126,000 Allied prisoners of war from camps in the Philippines, Java, Singapore, and other conquered territories to slave labor sites in Japan, Korea, and Manchuria. The transports operated according to logistics that treated human cargo as less valuable than military supplies, with mortality rates that exceeded 20% during voyages. The ships themselves were converted cargo vessels, oil tankers, and ancient freighters never designed for human transport. Prisoners were loaded into holds originally intended for coal, ore, or livestock, with no modifications for basic human needs. Ventilation systems were sealed to prevent escapes. Sanitation facilities were non-existent. Medical care was prohibited. The mathematical precision of the suffering was deliberate. Japanese military planners calculated that some prisoner deaths during transport were acceptable losses, provided sufficient numbers survived to provide useful labor. The system operated with bureaucratic efficiency that documented cargo loads, transport schedules, and delivery quotas, while ignoring the human cost of achieving those logistics. Ship captains received orders to maintain secrecy about prisoner cargo, often sailing without proper markings that would identify vessels as carrying prisoners of war. This deception made the transports legitimate targets for Allied submarines and aircraft, creating situations where prisoners faced death from their own forces' attacks on unmarked Japanese vessels. Life in the steel coffins. The conditions aboard hellships defied human endurance, yet thousands of men survived voyages that lasted weeks or months through some of the most dangerous waters in the Pacific. The holds became laboratories of human degradation, where men learned the absolute limits of physical and psychological survival. Private George Reynolds of the Manchester Regiment had been captured at Singapore in February 1942. 2 years of imprisonment had reduced his weight from 165 pounds to 98 pounds. But the hellship voyage on the Hofuku Maru pushed him to the edge of death through systematic deprivation that exceeded anything he had previously experienced. "We were packed standing up," Reynolds wrote in testimony recorded after his rescue. "No room to sit, no room to lie down. Men passed out and stayed upright because there was nowhere to fall. The heat was like being inside a furnace. Sweat dripped constantly, but there was no water to drink. Men went mad from thirst. The darkness was complete, except when guards occasionally opened hatches to remove corpses or distribute minimal rations. Prisoners learned to distinguish day from night by subtle temperature changes and the rhythm of ship operations above their heads. Time became meaningless in an environment where each hour felt like eternity. Disease spread rapidly through the confined space. Dysentery was universal, creating sanitation conditions that defied description. Men with fever burned against neighbors who couldn't move away from the heat. Infected wounds went untreated, spreading gangrene and sepsis that killed slowly and painfully. The Bataan Veterans. Many hellship prisoners were survivors of the Bataan Death March and subsequent imprisonment at Camp O'Donnell and Cabanatuan. These men had already endured systematic starvation, disease, and brutality that had killed thousands of their comrades. The hellship voyages represented a final stage of suffering that tested survival skills learned through years of captivity. Sergeant Mike Kowalski had marched the length of Bataan in April 1942, watched friends die from malaria and dysentery at O'Donnell, and survived work details that were designed to kill prisoners through exhaustion. His experience had taught him that survival required absolute mental discipline and careful conservation of physical resources. The march was horrible. The camps were worse. But the ship was hell itself, Kowalski testified. On the march, you could still breathe. In the camps, there was still sky above you. On the ship, you couldn't tell if you were alive or dead. Men talked to corpses, couldn't tell the difference anymore. The Bataan veterans often became leaders among hellship prisoners, using survival techniques learned during previous ordeals to help organize whatever cooperation was possible in the cramped conditions. They established systems for sharing water, supporting sick men, and maintaining discipline that prevented complete chaos. Their experience with Japanese captivity had taught them to expect brutality, but the hellships exceeded even their understanding of systematic cruelty. The complete indifference to prisoner welfare represented a level of dehumanization that challenged their ability to maintain hope for eventual liberation. The Submarine War. The American submarine campaign against Japanese shipping had intensified dramatically by 1944, sinking over 600 Japanese vessels during the year and effectively cutting Japan's maritime supply lines to its conquered territories. The submarines operated throughout Japanese-controlled waters, attacking any vessel that could support the enemy war effort. The USS Pampanito, under command of Lieutenant Commander Paul Summers, was conducting its 6th war patrol in September 1944 when it encountered convoy Mota 30 carrying prisoners from the Philippines to Japan. The submarine's primary mission was attacking Japanese shipping, with strict orders to sink enemy vessels on sight. The convoy included the Rakuyo Maru and Kachidoki Maru, both carrying over 2,000 Allied prisoners of war along with Japanese personnel and military supplies. Neither ship displayed markings indicating prisoner cargo, making them legitimate targets under international law and operational orders that governed submarine warfare. Submarine crews had been briefed on the possibility of Japanese vessels carrying Allied prisoners, but intelligence about specific ships was often incomplete or non-existent. The decision to attack or investigate required split-second judgments that could mean the difference between successful missions and lost opportunities. The attack. At 21:59 hours on September 12, 1944, USS Pampanito fired 4 torpedoes at the Rakuyo Maru from a range of 1,800 yards. 2 torpedoes struck the vessel amidships, causing massive explosions that ruptured the hull and started fires throughout the ship. The vessel began sinking immediately, listing heavily to starboard as water flooded the damaged compartments. The torpedo explosions killed hundreds of prisoners instantly, either from direct blast effects or crushing injuries as steel bulkheads collapsed. Those who survived the initial impact faced the nightmare of escaping from sealed holds that were rapidly flooding with seawater mixed with oil and debris. Lieutenant O'Connor found himself thrown against the bulkhead by the first explosion, his right arm broken by flying metal. Around him, men screamed in languages he couldn't identify as water began pouring through torn plates in the ship's hull. The guards had abandoned their posts, leaving the prisoners sealed in holds that would become death traps within minutes. The ship was breaking apart around us, O'Connor recalled. Men were clawing at the hatches, trying to get out, but they were locked from above. Water was rising fast, and we could hear the ship's death sounds, metal tearing, steam escaping, the roar of rushing water. I thought we would all drown like rats in a trap. Some prisoners managed to break through weakened hatches or squeeze through blast holes that had torn open escape routes. Others drowned in the holds as the ship settled deeper in the water. The survivors who reached the surface faced a new challenge: staying alive in shark-infested waters while oil fires burned around the sinking vessel. Into the dark water. The South China Sea at night became a floating hell where hundreds of men struggled to survive in water contaminated with fuel oil, debris, and blood from the wounded. The ocean temperature was warm enough to prevent immediate hypothermia, but exhaustion, dehydration, and infected wounds created deadly conditions for men already weakened by years of captivity. The prisoners who escaped the sinking ships faced immediate threats from oil fires, floating debris, and the possibility of additional submarine attacks. Many couldn't swim well enough to stay afloat for extended periods, while others were too weak from malnutrition to maintain themselves in the water without support. Makeshift flotation devices, wooden planks, empty barrels, life preservers salvaged from the wreckage, became lifelines for men who had to choose between sharing limited resources or fighting for individual survival. The same cooperation that had sustained them during captivity now determined who would live long enough to be rescued. Sergeant Reynolds found himself clinging to a piece of wooden decking with 5 other men, including 2 who were unconscious from injuries sustained during the sinking. The oil slick burning around them created a moving wall of fire that forced constant movement to avoid being trapped by flames. "We took turns holding up the unconscious men," Reynolds testified. "Nobody talked much. We were all too weak, too scared. But we kept each other alive. After 3 years of the Japs treating us like animals, we weren't going to let each other die now that we had a chance." The rescue decision. 3 days after the attack, submarines USS Pampanito and USS Celian returned to the area to conduct damage assessment and search for additional targets. The crews expected to find empty ocean and scattered debris from the destroyed convoy. Instead, they discovered over 150 Allied prisoners of war floating in life rafts and clinging to wreckage. The discovery created an immediate tactical dilemma for submarine commanders operating in enemy-controlled waters. Rescue operations would require surfacing for extended periods, making the submarines vulnerable to air attacks and enemy vessels. The boats were designed for combat operations, not humanitarian missions, with limited space and supplies for additional personnel. Lieutenant Commander Summers faced a decision that would define his career and the lives of men floating in the water around his submarine. Orders called for continuing patrol operations, but Navy regulations also mandated assistance to survivors when operationally feasible. The presence of Allied prisoners complicated both legal and moral calculations. "We could see them waving at us," recalled Torpedoman First Class Richard O'Kane. "They were calling out in English, begging us to pick them up. Some of them were dying right there in the water." The skipper didn't hesitate. He ordered emergency surface and rescue operations. "We knew the risks, but we couldn't leave our own people to die." The moment of recognition. For prisoners floating in the South China Sea, the sight of American submarines surfacing nearby created emotions that exceeded relief or gratitude. Men who had expected death from their own force's weapons instead found salvation from the same submarines that had torpedoed their ships. The initial contact between rescue crews and prisoners revealed the extent of physical and psychological damage inflicted by years of captivity, followed by days of exposure at sea. Many survivors were too weak to swim to the submarines and had to be physically pulled from the water by rescue swimmers. Lieutenant O'Connor had been floating for 72 hours when USS Pampanito surfaced nearby. His broken arm had become infected, and delirium from dehydration made him initially suspicious of the rescue attempt. When American sailors threw him a line, he hesitated, uncertain whether he was hallucinating or facing another form of Japanese deception. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," O'Connor recalled. "A few days ago, these same submarines had been trying to kill us. Now they were risking their lives to save us. When that sailor grabbed my arm and pulled me onto the deck, I started crying. I hadn't cried since Bataan, but I couldn't stop the tears." The physical contact with American personnel created immediate psychological relief that exceeded the comfort of rescue itself. For men who had been treated as subhuman for years, being addressed by name, offered assistance, and treated with dignity represented restoration of basic humanity that captivity had systematically destroyed. Aboard the rescuing submarines. The interior of American submarines provided sharp contrast to the conditions prisoners had endured during captivity and the hell ship voyage. Clean, well-ventilated spaces with adequate lighting and temperature control created environments that seemed luxurious to men accustomed to systematic deprivation. The submarine crews immediately provided medical attention, food, and clothing to rescued prisoners who arrived aboard suffering from malnutrition, dehydration, infected wounds, and exhaustion. The submarine's medical facilities, though limited, represented the first professional medical care many prisoners had received since capture. Pharmacist's mate, second class Tommy Martinez, had trained for combat medicine, not treating prisoners of war who had survived years of systematic starvation and abuse. His medical supplies were designed for treating submarine crew injuries, not the complex health problems presented by severely malnourished survivors. They were skin and bones, Martinez recalled. Some weighed maybe 80 pounds, covered with sores, missing teeth, showing signs of diseases I'd only read about in medical books. But their eyes, when you gave them food, real food, their eyes lit up like they couldn't believe it was real. Waha. The galley crews prepared special meals for rescued prisoners whose digestive systems couldn't handle normal submarine food after years of inadequate nutrition. Soup, soft bread, and easily digestible foods were served in small portions designed to rebuild strength gradually, without causing additional medical complications. The psychological impact. The experience of being rescued by former enemies created psychological effects that challenged prisoners' understanding of warfare, nationality, and human nature. Men who had been conditioned to expect death from American forces instead received life-saving assistance that forced fundamental reevaluation of their assumptions about their captors and rescuers. The contrast between Japanese treatment during captivity and American treatment during rescue was so stark that many survivors initially suspected deception or propaganda. The genuine kindness shown by submarine crews gradually convinced them that their circumstances had fundamentally changed, but acceptance required time and repeated evidence. Corporal Bill Henderson, rescued by USS Celian, described the psychological adjustment. For 3 years, any uniform meant trouble. Japanese guards, Korean guards, civilian supervisors, they all meant beatings, starvation, humiliation. When I saw American uniforms, my first instinct was still fear. It took days to understand that these men were trying to help, not hurt me. The submarine crews also experienced psychological challenges in treating men whose condition revealed the extent of Japanese war crimes. Many sailors had to confront evidence of systematic cruelty that exceeded their previous understanding of enemy behavior and created lasting anger toward Japanese forces. The medical challenges. Treating rescued hell ship survivors required medical improvisation that exceeded standard submarine medical capabilities. The prisoners arrived with complex health problems resulting from years of malnutrition, disease, and injury that had received no proper medical attention. Dehydration was universal among the survivors, but standard rehydration procedures had to be modified for men whose kidneys and circulatory systems had been compromised by prolonged starvation. Intravenous fluids were administered slowly to prevent shock that could prove fatal to severely weakened patients. Skin conditions resulting from vitamin deficiencies, poor hygiene, and exposure to tropical diseases required treatments that weren't available in submarine medical supplies. Improvised remedies using available materials provided some relief, but many conditions required extended medical treatment that submarines couldn't provide. Psychological trauma manifested in behaviors that submarine crews found difficult to understand or address. Some survivors hoarded food, unable to believe that more would be provided. Others remained hypervigilant, expecting punishment or violence, despite obvious evidence of their rescuers' good intentions. The food revolution. Access to adequate food aboard American submarines created immediate physical and psychological changes among rescued prisoners who had been systematically starved for years. The availability of calories, proteins, and vitamins that had been denied during captivity began restoring both physical health and mental clarity. The submarine galleys provided foods that most prisoners hadn't seen since before their capture, fresh bread, canned meat, vegetables, fruit, coffee, and sugar. These items represented not just nutrition, but symbols of the abundance that characterized Allied supply systems compared to Japanese scarcity. The psychological impact of unlimited food access was often as dramatic as the physical effects. Men who had been fighting for scraps began experiencing difficulty eating adequate amounts, their stomachs having adapted to starvation-level nutrition over years of captivity. Cook second class. Bobby Chen prepared special meals for rescued prisoners, learning to adjust portions and ingredients for men whose digestive systems required careful refeeding. His galley became a center for recovery, where food served as medicine for both body and spirit. The personal connections, extended contact between submarine crews and rescued prisoners created personal relationships that transcended the formal military relationships typical of wartime service. The intimate conditions aboard submarines fostered conversations and friendships that helped both groups process their wartime experiences. Many submarine crew members were young men serving in their first major combat assignment, while rescued prisoners were often older soldiers with extensive combat and captivity experience. These generational and experiential differences created learning opportunities that benefited both groups. The prisoners shared stories of survival techniques, cultural observations from their captivity, and intelligence information about Japanese operations that proved valuable for future submarine missions. Their experiences provided human context for the war that helped submarine crews understand the broader impact of their combat operations. Submarine personnel shared news from home, updates on the war's progress, and optimistic assessments about Allied victory that helped prisoners understand how much the strategic situation had changed during their captivity. This information provided hope that had been systematically denied during imprisonment. The continuing patrol. The submarines carrying rescued prisoners had to continue their patrol missions while providing care for men who required constant medical attention and psychological support. This dual mission created operational challenges that tested the vessel's capabilities and crew's adaptability. Space limitations aboard submarines meant that rescued prisoners had to share quarters designed for much smaller crews. Sleeping arrangements, sanitation facilities, and recreational space all required creative solutions that maintained submarine operational capability while accommodating humanitarian obligations. The psychological stress of continued combat operations while caring for traumatized survivors affected submarine crews who found themselves balancing military duties with humanitarian responsibilities. Some crew members struggled with anger toward Japanese forces after witnessing evidence of prisoner mistreatment. Combat effectiveness remained the primary mission requirement, but the presence of rescued prisoners provided additional motivation for submarine crews who now understood the personal stakes involved in their attacks on Japanese shipping and installations. The intelligence value. Rescued Hell ship survivors provided valuable intelligence about Japanese prisoner handling, transportation routes, camp conditions, and military operations they had observed during captivity. This information helped Allied forces plan rescue operations and prepare for prisoner recovery during future campaigns. The prisoners' knowledge of Japanese logistics revealed patterns in prisoner transportation that helped submarine commanders identify likely Hell ship routes and target vessels that might be carrying Allied personnel. This intelligence contributed to more effective rescue operations during subsequent encounters. Information about Japanese industrial operations, where prisoners had been forced to work, provided targeting data for bombing campaigns and sabotage operations. The survivors' detailed knowledge of factory layouts, production schedules, and security procedures proved valuable for military planning. Medical intelligence about diseases, malnutrition effects, and survival techniques helped Allied medical personnel prepare for treating liberated prisoners during future operations. The health data documented the systematic nature of Japanese prisoner mistreatment and provided evidence for war crimes prosecutions. The delivery to safety. The submarines carrying rescued Hell ship survivors faced the challenge of delivering their human cargo to appropriate medical facilities while maintaining operational security and continuing their patrol missions. The solutions required coordination with Allied naval forces and modification of standard operational procedures. USS Pampanito and USS Celian arranged rendezvous with hospital ships and transport vessels that could provide specialized medical care for rescued prisoners. The transfer operations required surfacing in waters where Japanese forces might detect and attack the submarines. The rescued prisoners who had to reconcile their previous understanding of warfare with evidence of enemy humanity and compassion. This transformation influenced their post-war attitudes toward international relations and conflict resolution. Many survivors became advocates for international humanitarian law and prisoner protection, using their experiences to promote treaties and conventions that would prevent similar systematic abuse during future conflicts. Their testimony provided human context for legal frameworks governing prisoner treatment. The contrast between Japanese cruelty and American mercy influenced survivors' understanding of democratic values and individual human rights. Many became supporters of democratic political systems and international cooperation based on their direct experience of different approaches to human dignity. Some survivors struggled to forgive their Japanese captors while maintaining gratitude toward their American rescuers. The psychological complexity of hatred and gratitude existing simultaneously required personal reconciliation that took years or decades to achieve. The final testament. Decades after the war ended, Hell Ship survivors continued to credit their American rescuers with not just saving their lives, but restoring their faith in human decency after years of systematic cruelty. The rescue operations represented turning points that transformed hatred into hope and despair into determination to rebuild meaningful lives. The physical scars of captivity faded over time, but the psychological impact of being rescued by former enemies remained vivid throughout survivors' lives. Many experienced mixed emotions during transfer to hospital ships, grateful for continued medical care, but reluctant to leave crews who had saved their lives. Personal bonds formed during submarine rescue created lasting relationships that many survivors maintained long after the war ended. Medical personnel aboard hospital ships found themselves treating patients whose conditions exceeded standard combat casualty protocols. The rescued Hell Ship survivors required specialized care that addressed not just immediate medical needs, but long-term rehabilitation from systematic mistreatment. The medical recovery. The physical rehabilitation of rescued Hell Ship survivors required months or years of specialized medical treatment that addressed both immediate health crises and long-term damage from systematic malnutrition and abuse. Many survivors faced permanent health consequences from their captivity experience. Weight restoration proceeded slowly under medical supervision that prevented refeeding syndrome and other complications that could prove fatal to severely malnourished patients. Nutritional rehabilitation required careful monitoring and gradual increases in caloric intake that allowed digestive systems to recover gradually. Dental problems resulting from malnutrition and lack of hygiene required extensive treatment that often included extraction of damaged teeth and treatment of advanced gum disease. Many survivors required dentures or other dental prosthetics to restore basic eating capability. Psychological recovery proved more challenging than physical rehabilitation for many survivors who struggled with trauma-related symptoms that persisted long after their physical health improved. Mental health treatment in the 1940s was limited, but some survivors received pioneering therapy for what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The psychological transformation. The experience of being rescued by former enemies created lasting psychological changes among Hell Ship survivors, the moment of rescue as their spiritual rebirth. When they learned that human kindness could overcome systematic evil. The submarine crews who pulled dying men from the South China Sea proved that America's greatest strength lay not in its weapons or industrial capacity, but in its willingness to risk everything to save human lives, even enemy lives. In those desperate moments when submarines surfaced in hostile waters to rescue drowning prisoners, the true meaning of democratic values was written on the dark waters of the Pacific, not in words but in actions that transformed enemies into brothers, and hatred into hope for a world where mercy could triumph over vengeance, where humanity could survive even the deepest cruelty, and where former foes could find common ground in the simple recognition that every life was worth saving, regardless of the uniform it had worn or the flag it had served.